Hey, friends, welcome to Deeper. We're a podcast and vodcast about the Bible and theology. And today we've got a wonderful guest, actually my doctoral advisor, Professor Jon D. Levenson from Harvard University. Professor Levenson is a scholar of Jewish studies, Hebrew Bible, theology, very wide-ranging. I got to study with him for many years, and he's been kind enough to sit down with us today to talk about the book of Exodus as it relates to certain theological movements. That touch on the world today. So, Professor Levenson, hearty welcome to you. And do you mind if I brag about you for just a minute longer before we start talking?
I probably do mind. Make it at least 10 minutes.
Okay, at least 10 minutes.
Okay.
Well, I wanted to share with our friends this stack of books, which are all by Professor Levenson, and there are more, but I want to make you aware he's a Jewish scholar that Christians such as myself find enormously helpful, enormously fair-minded and insightful. And so just to give you a sense of some of the work that he's done over the years, this is a book, here we go, called Sinai and Zion, an entry into the Jewish Bible. And if you're looking for an overview of what we call the Old Testament, this is a fantastic book. I recommend. Here's a book called The Death and Resurrection of the Beloved Son, the Transformation of Child Sacrifice in Judaism and Christianity. It looks at some of the key stories in the Old Testament of Joseph and Isaac and other elect sons that nearly die. And for Christians, that does ring a bell because of the main story of the New Testament. So this is a very interesting book, exploring some of the same themes. This is called Resurrection and the Restoration of Israel, the Ultimate Victory of the God of Life, winner of the National Jewish Book Awards. Do you remember writing all these books, Professor Levenson?
No, I'm senile.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this book, some of the content appears in this book, which is written together with a Christian scholar at Harvard named Kevin Madigan, and it's called Resurrection, the Power of God for Christians and Jews. If you're interested in understanding the doctrine of resurrection, this is a fantastic starting place. Here's another book. It's called Inheriting Abraham, the Legacy of the Patriarch in Judaism, Christianity, Islam. Fantastic study of Abraham as he appears in all three classic monotheisms. And very, very interesting book. By the way, if you're watching this, just so you know, we will have in our show notes links to all these books so that if you want to follow up on any of them, you sure can. This is a commentary on the book of Esther. Great story in the Old Testament, Hebrew Bible, and it's in the Old Testament Library series. Three more. This is, in theological circles, a well-known book. It's called Creation and the Persistence of Evil, the Jewish Drama of Divine Omnipotence. And it looks at early chapters of Genesis, the battle between chaos and order, and how that figures into temple theology in ancient Israel. Very, very interesting book. And then these last two books are books that we're going to talk about today, actually. This one here is called The Love of God, Divine Gift, Human Gratitude, and Mutual Faithfulness in Judaism. So to look at the core belief about what do we mean that God is a loving, compassionate God. We will talk about that today, along with an essay from this book. This is an earlier work. It's called The Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and Historical Criticism. It looks at some methodological issues in the study of the Bible, and it's very relevant for people who are trying to be both intellectually rigorous and people of faith in some ways, and understanding the background issues there. So I have been enormously grateful and privileged to study with you, Dr. Levenson, and thanks for taking some time with us today.
Well, thank you for having me. Thank you for pumping those books, which I very much appreciate. And it was always a pleasure, and your listeners and viewers should know it was always a pleasure and delight to have you in class and have our conversations over the years. And I'm so honored to be here today.
Thank you. Thank you. So we got a few questions that we're going to try to get through. And the first one, I didn't write this, but the first one is this. What do you remember most about your former star pupil, Ryan John Gregg? you have any thoughts or things you want to expound upon?
Well, how long do we actually have?
You know,
I think
go ahead.
I really don't think I could even begin to touch the surface of that, except that you were one of the most creative, energetic, and theologically engaged students I've ever had. You're also probably the only one I ever had that hunted elk in Montana.
That's true.
And you're definitely the only one I ever had who brought me back a wolf hat, which was the face of a wolf. I think the teeth are in there and they're little marbles or something for the eyes. And it's really one of my proudest possessions. It was hard for me not to wear it today. It's 75 here. And I thought I might look strange walking around with this wolf hat on a hot summer day.
That's
But
true. There's some backstory for that, isn't there? On your
yes,
end? Tell us
there's a
that
long
story, would you?
backstory that I when I was in Montana, I wanted to buy that from a Native American crafts fair, and I still had it sold for $24. But I happened to be passing through there just as a tourist. I wasn't looking in the shops; I just happened to pass by and saw this on the Sabbath. And I said, well, I made a mental note, which I probably shouldn't have, that I'll be back the next day. And I was back the next day, but that stall was gone and that hat was gone. And only when I met Ryan, John, Greg, did the possibility come up that I might yet get from Montana an authentic, probably Native American crafts wolf hat. So it means more to me than most people realize.
Does your wife approve of it?
No,
Okay.
she strongly disapproves. I tend to wear it at Purim, which is a Jewish holiday where people wear bizarre costumes and so forth, and I don't know, cross dress or whatever. And even then, she tells me it's not very nice. It's not in great taste. Yeah.
I see.
So anyway,
Well, shall we turn to the Bible?
yes, let's do that. Yeah.
Okay. So our church, the Bay Church in the Bay Area, California, just did a sermon on the book of Exodus and looking at God's intervention on behalf of the Israelites and what that tells us about God. And an issue in the background of the sermon that we didn't have a chance to talk on was the view of some theologians that what happens there in the book of Exodus between the Israelite slaves and the Egyptians is sort of a classic class struggle. There's a sort of social revolution, and some theologians have built a whole framework on this with the idea that a sort of a revolutionary preferential option for the poor should be seen as normative for a biblical worldview. And I know your own scholarship has touched on some of those issues. So can you give us a sense of where that theological conversation comes from, what some of its talking points are, what some of its strengths and weaknesses are?
Yeah, that's what is usually called liberation theology. I'm not sure when it originated, but it became very prominent in the American theological world, at least Protestant and Catholic, probably more so Protestant than Catholic, in the 1960s and 70s. And it became very powerful in liberal Protestantism. The notion of the preferential option for the poor, that God is especially concerned with the poor and wants his worshipers to be especially concerned with the well-being of the poor, which includes not just the financially poor, but the outsider, the sojourner, the widow, the orphan. That is certainly accurate, and that runs throughout the Hebrew Bible. It's part of the royal ethic, the ethic of a king in the ancient Near East, and certainly including the divine king in ancient Israel. The problem with it is not that it stresses God's special concern for the poor. The problem with it when it's applied to the Exodus is that it makes the beneficiaries of the Exodus, God, the ones God took out of Egypt, into simply a social class, into the poor, the marginalized, or whatever. That may or may not be true as some sort of highly speculative reconstruction of the underlying history. But at the level of the manifest text, what the book of Exodus actually says, the beneficiaries of the Exodus are united by their descent from a common ancestor, namely the common patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They're the only ones taken out of Egypt. No one else is taken out of Egypt. They're not liberated in Egypt. There's no sense that slavery has been abolished in Egypt. There's no sense that non-Israelite slaves profited the least from God's taking the Israelites out of Egypt. In other words, if I were to try to rewrite the book of Exodus so as to conform to the underlying history that's very speculatively reconstructed by the liberation theologians, you would have the Israelites and all other slaves in Egypt liberated and freed to stay in Egypt and continue to live there under some new egalitarian regime. That's not at all what Exodus says. And in fact, when the Israelites come out of Egypt, no sooner they stand on Sinai at in Mount Sinai in Exodus 21, then the first law they're given has to do with the treatment of slaves. That's a humane treatment, a law counseling, mandating a certain humane treatment for the domestic slave, the debt slave, the Israelite slave. Probably does not include foreign slaves, POWs and the like, but it doesn't abolish slavery. There's no hint of the abolition of slavery anywhere in these ancient sources. So I think what the liberation theologians do is they take a highly conjectural reconstruction of the underlying history and use it to substitute for the plain sense of the biblical text. Now, what makes them do that? Well, the high estimation of communism, Marxism in general, social revolution in the 1960s and 70s, especially in intellectual circles and academic circles, certainly played a major role in that. And those circles are still very, very powerful in the academy, as you know better than most. But also, I think, a long-standing Christian tradition of reading the Old Testament typologically so that the people of Israel signifies something else.
Right.
In the classical Christian theology, the people of Israel signify the new Israel, which is the church, the community of the baptized. It's not universal humanity. It's the community of the baptized. It's the church. The liberation theologians have taken that one step further. They continue to see the people of Israel, the flesh and blood Jewish people, with their descent from a common ancestor, as superseded. But now they're superseded by a social class, the poor, the marginalized, and so forth and so on, which secularizes the story, makes it much more palatable to, let's say, non-believers, atheists, social revolutionaries, Marxists, and so forth. But at the same time, in my opinion, is done at a very, very high cost in terms of the plain sense of the book of Exodus.
Right. And one of the things in the plain sense of Exodus in the story is that when God is commissioning Moses from Sinai to return, he says, you should go to Pharaoh and tell him this: Israel is my firstborn son. Let him go that he may come serve me, v'ya'avdeni, which is the same verb that's used again and again for servitude to Egypt. So whereas the story of the Exodus is often framed as a movement from slavery to freedom, seems to be more of a movement from one sort of slavery to another sort of slavery or servitude. And can you comment a little bit on that, this notion in the Bible of the servant of the Lord, servitude to God? What is that? What's that all about?
Well, it's certainly the case that, I think you put it very well, that the point is not freedom in the book of Exodus and the Hebrew Bible generally. Certainly not freedom in the modern sense of autonomy, self-determination. Yeah. Autonomy and self-determination in the Bible generally are seen as characteristic of the sinner. The real human dignity comes from the subjugation, the joyful and redemptive subjugation to the will of God. So people like to say, let my people go. That sounds like we're talking about modern notions of freedom. But the biblical text actually is, Shalachatami v'yavduni b'midbar. Let my people go, release them, so they may serve me, be my slave, my servant in the wilderness. That's a very big difference. And in fact, in Leviticus 25:55, this is put beautifully. Why can't an Israelite, a member of the people of Israel, oppress a fellow Israelite as a slave, treat a fellow Israelite as a bafarach, as Pharaoh treated them in Egypt, harshly, severely? Here's the translation. For to me, the people of Israel are servants. To me, with a capital M, it's God. They're servants of Hashem. They're servants of the God of Israel. They're my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. In other words, in a sense, what Pharaoh is doing is slave rustling. He's stealing the people whom God has dedicated, singled out for himself, and trying to. Now, this is not to say the service of the God of Israel and the service of Pharaoh are varieties of the same thing. Yes, the Bible uses the same word, eved, for both forms of servitude. And there's a long-standing biblical convention of translating Eved when it's connection with, let's say, Pharaoh or a human master as slave, but the same word when it signifies a divine, when it's servitude to a divine master, as servant.
Right.
I think there is something in common between the two forms of servitude, but Pharaoh is presented as a self-inflating, egocentric human in defiance to the divine will, whereas the God of Israel is seen as a kind, philanthropic, reliable Redeemer God. A huge difference there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The New Testament has a similar textual issue, the word doulos, which is often translated as bondservants, but doulos is the classic Greek term for slaves in the Greco-Roman world. But translators kind of get squirmy, or it's translated with a variety of nuances that actually prevents us from seeing the same underlying concept as it appears in different contexts.
Yes, that's right. That's right. If you simply set God and Pharaoh as absolute opposites, and there's nothing in common, you miss this element of servitude, of servanthood, and you very seriously misunderstand, I think, the Hebrew Bible and also the New Testament.
Yeah. So I want to approach this also from another aspect. As you talk of the God of Israel, the of Israel part is very vital. There's issues here of election and covenants, and so can you help us see the link here between the ideas of Israel's special status as the elect, chosen, covenant people of God, and this idea of sort of a paradox of liberating servitude? How do those things interact?
That's a big question. That's a difficult question. God's love of Israel, which is affirmed many times in the Bible, has with it some nuance of choosing, of singling out, of what Christians tend to call election. I don't particularly like the term election because I think for a lot of Christians, they hear the election of Israel, they think those who are elected for salvation, as opposed to those who are not elected and are headed for damnation or perdition. That's not the duality in the Hebrew Bible. Think of the fact that for the prophets, a metaphor of election and the God-Israel relationship, very strong metaphor, is the husband-wife paradigm, husband-wife image. Now, Pastor Gray, surely there are many, many women in the world to whom you're not married.
This is true.
Am I correct on that?
This is true.
Do you hate them? Do you think they're morally inferior? Do you think they're all headed for hell? Probably not. But that doesn't mean that you don't have a unique and special relationship with your wife. So the same thing is true here. In Deuteronomy 7, it's the basis for the election of Israel and the basis for the Exodus is presented as God's having fallen in love with those avot, those ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and having made an oath to them to give them the land of Israel. And it's precisely because Pharaoh is detaining them in Egypt that his power has to be broken and Israel has to be taken out of Egypt. It's not a liberation of slaves so much, it is partly that, but it's also a divine fulfillment of the land promise, which is what energizes the whole Pentateuch, the whole first 5 books of the Bible, and into the 6th book, which is Joshua. So this love notion it's mysterious. Deuteronomy 7 is very eager to say, lo merubachem, you're not more numerous than any other people. It's not that God chose you because you're the biggest people. On the contrary, you're very small. Milton Himmelfarb was a Jewish sociologist and cultural commentator of the previous generation, who said something along the lines of this. He said the total number of Jews in the world is less than the margin of statistical error in the Chinese census. So it's not that you're so numerous or so powerful or so smart or so this other, you have more Nobel Prize winners than anybody else. All this, if true or whatever, is completely beside the point. God fell in love. It's what we call chemistry. You really can't give an algorithm to define and regulate love. But having done that, and especially having taken them out of Egypt, they are now in his debt. They feel gratitude and joy, and therefore they respond with service. Service not as a degrading form of subjugation like service to Pharaoh, who's presented as a sadist, but service to their liberator, to their emancipator. I mean, that's the duality. That's the paradox. It's service to an emancipator, service to a rescuer, a service to a redeemer. The concept of redemption as terminating in something other than service, I think, would be considered very strange in general in the ancient Near Eastern world, certainly in the world of the Hebrew Bible, and certainly in the world of Rabbinic Judaism.
Yes.
In Rabbinic Judaism is a famous statement from a 3rd century sage from the land of Israel in the 3rd century under Roman occupation, who said, nobody is free except one who occupies himself with the study of Torah.
Hmm.
I mean, that's an extreme statement. It's somewhat like similar things Paul makes about the freedom of the Christian and so forth, similar, with significant differences. But clearly, freedom is not self-determination.
Yeah.
It's very closely connected to service, and service is connected to the love of God, and in turn, to God's prevenient love of the people of Israel.
Yeah. You touch on something important here, the idea of gratitude in response to a gift. There's a study of Pauline theology called Paul and the Gift by William Barclay, and it looks at the ancient sociology of gift giving, and it challenges the concept in our day that a gift is it's completely without strings attached. It's a gift. If it had strings attached, it wouldn't be a gift. It'd be something else. It'd be payment. It'd be a bribe. It'd be something like that. But that in the ancient world, gifts could simultaneously be totally free and yet not unconditional in some sense.
Right.
And so the gift of God is it's not a gift as we understand it. And I think in your book, The Love of God, one of the most helpful things for me was helping expand my notion of God's love out of the realm of the subjective. It is there, just like you talked about. God fell in love. It's chemistry. It's a sort of it's a romance. And yet, love means a great deal more than that. It's a instrumental. It's provisional. It's variety. Can you help us help us take the most sort of pop romanticized version of love in our day and help us make it more robust with a biblical understanding of what that means?
Well, that's a lot of people today, when they think of love, they first of all think only of sexual love, erotic love. So I say the prophets do have a marriage metaphor for God-Israel relationship. But they also see God as a shepherd. Shepherd flock is another prominent metaphor. King's subject is another prominent metaphor. Farmer in his field can be found. There are a lot of different metaphors for the God-Israel relationship. Therefore, I would be very skeptical about making eros, in the sense of sexual love, the paradigm, which many people actually do. Second, people think of it as a feeling. They think of it as an emotion. And think about feelings and emotions is that they pass pretty soon, pretty far, they pretty quickly. They evaporate pretty quickly. And so there have to be practices in which they are incorporated and embedded, so that there's a ritualized or habitual dimension to that love, or it simply evaporates pretty fast. I think in the ancient world, the ancient Near Eastern world, in the biblical world, love often could be understood as a set of actions. It certainly mandates certain actions. It's on one hand freely given, it's unexpected, but having been given, then these two people are now in a relationship. God, the deity, and the Am Yisrael, the people of Israel, the Jewish people, are now in a special relationship. Also, God and the church, God and the Christian, the New Testament are in a special relationship. It's not universal humanity we're talking about. It has that specificity of a relationship like a marriage relationship, or a relationship of a shepherd to his own flock, that sort of metaphor. So in that sense, I would agree with Barclay. I think that people have a notion of gift as something you just take and leave. I think gift giving in cultures creates relationships, and relationships necessarily impose some obligations. You can't just walk away from someone who's benefited you, or pretend that there's no expectation of reciprocity.
Why I gave you a wolf hat,
That's exactly, and that's why I go to my way to say, even on the air now, thank you for my wolf hat.
You are.
And I keep it to routinize and habituate the relationship between you and me. Every time I see that wolf with those sharp teeth, I say to myself, Dr. Pastor Ryan John Gregg.
Yeah, I understand that. That was my strategy. I had a strategy.
I may even name the hat Ryan, John, Greg. Just
Wow.
yeah, yeah.
That's ferocious. You know, my paternal grandfather was born, his original last name was Lopez,
Hmm.
because he was born to Hispanic parents, but via divorce, he changed his last name to Greg, and that's why I'm Ryan Greg, not Ryan Lopez. However, you know the meaning of Lopez, don't you? It's related to Lupe and all those.
Yeah, yeah.
It
Lupus,
means,
wolf. Yeah,
it means
yeah,
wolf. So you see what I'm saying? My
yeah,
wolf hat, it works for me.
yeah, yeah. But why did he change from Lopez to Greg?
It had to do with my great grandmother was married 3 times. The first man's last name was Lopez, the second man's last name was Greg, and the third man's
Oh, I
last
see.
name, I don't know. But they
Hmm.
didn't change my grandpa's name a third time. So
Okay, yeah. Well, it sounds like the basis for a good novel.
maybe
Yeah.
let me circle back to something. You know, for a lot of our Christian listeners, putting the idea of God's Torah, the law, and love in the same sentence is maybe pretty counterintuitive. And because there's been a pretty overly stark contrast between law and grace and Old Testament, New Testament, so forth. Help us understand, just from a Jewish perspective, how love and law work together in a harmonious way.
Well, in the traditional Jewish theology, especially rabbinic theology, but you can see antecedents of this in the Hebrew Bible, especially the book of Deuteronomy, which is the biblical book that focuses on the love of God, love for God, and God's love for Israel more than any other book. And in those places, you can see that one of the great gifts of God is this Torah, this whatever Deuteronomy means by Torah, this instruction, this teaching, this mitzvah, this set of obligations, whatever one wants to call it. That's not seen as a subjugation and a humiliation or whatever. It's seen as an elevation. That becomes a very important theme in traditional Jewish
Mm-hmm.
thought. The chance, the opportunity to serve the master, the redeemer, the loving, liberating master as he wants to be served, not just making it up on our own,
Mm-hmm.
but as he wants to be served, that's considered a very great privilege. So the loving God is itself a mitzvah, a formal obligation in Judaism based on Deuteronomy 6:5. You shall love the Lord your God, etc., etc. That's actual requirement. The requirement means doing those commandments. It does have an affective and subjective dimension, but it doesn't reduce to the affective or subjective dimension. There are obligations that are imposed. When you get to the New Testament, Paul is a very tricky thinker, and there are a lot of controversy and disputation, and he may not mean by those apparent oppositions of law and grace
True.
quite what moderns, by moderns I mean people like Martin Luther,
Right.
me, moderns everything after about 1200. Everything after about 1800 is journalism. But people like Martin Luther made of Paul. So a particular reading of Paul called, the scholars tend to call the Lutheran reading, by no means dead, but it has declined enormously in the last 50 years or so.
Yeah.
And you could have discussion with some Pauline scholars about this whole subject. But certainly from the continuing Jewish tradition, the Jewish tradition of the Talmud and Midrash, classical rabbinic texts, the notion that the love of God is intimately tied up with his gift of the Torah to the people of Israel is very, very prominent.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of rich stuff there.
And I think the Exodus more widely, to go back to that theme for a moment, it also terminates in a covenant making ceremony and then a gift of law. There's the covenant making ceremony in Exodus 19, the Decalogue in Exodus 20, and then all kinds of detailed laws starting in chapter 21 and off and on throughout the rest of the Pentateuch all the way through Deuteronomy. So the theme of redemption and narrative on the one hand, a narrative of redemption and national story on the one hand, and legal obligations, those are interwoven. I think to separate those two and set them at odds with each other is a very odd way to read that whole complex.
Right. And actually just on the Christian side, someone like Martin Luther and someone like John Calvin and their successors, respectively, have very different views of the Old Testament legislation, where Luther is, trafficking in a strict opposition. John Calvin is at pains to say, no, 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 this was a good thing. This is not a bad thing, and it's still useful in many ways. And so even within, even at the fount of Protestant theology, there's a great deal of difference here. And as you mentioned, in the last 50, 60 years, Paul has been read in radically new ways that are far more in flow, in step with the whole Bible, and not sort of pitting. It's sort of like for our listeners, there was once a early Christian monk in the 2nd, 3rd century. His name was Marcion, and his whole idea was to just sort of unhitch the Old Testament from the New Testament and just say, you know what, let's get rid of that. And that became called Marcionism. And the church, time and again, said that's not true. That's completely, that undercuts everything that we believe and hold dear. And so it's important to be aware of, I think, for Christians, the history of thought surrounding these issues, because it's not all the same. There's a great deal of variety in it.
That's right. That Marcionite heresy, that notion that the God of the Old Testament is not the same as the God of the New Testament. The Old Testament is a demiurge, a lesser God who created this mortal, decaying, messed up physical world, as opposed to the purely spiritual deity of the New Testament and so forth. That keeps coming up in history of Christianity. If I'm not mistaken, you can correct me on this. Adolf Harnack said something rather similar at the end of the 19th, early 20th century, something like that. There was some German theologian who within the last 10, 15 years said this. I can't remember his name. But again, it keeps coming up, and there's something in the Christianity that sort of generates it. But as you say, the majority position smacks it down every time.
It does.
I think it's fair to say, you could tell me, but I think it's fair to say that a lot of Christians who see themselves very devoted to the Bible don't know much about their Old Testament.
That's
Some
true.
do. Some do. I think the focus is more on New Testament. I remember Brent Strawn wrote a book, maybe you have read it, the Old Testament is Dying, and he talks about the general neglect of it and so on and so on.
I would say, though, there's a renaissance, especially among young people, and certain resources that have made it much more accessible and interesting. So it may have taken a dip, but among people my age, there's actually a deep interest.
I think that's true. I think that's very, very true. Yeah.
Well, I think that's about what we have time for today, my friend. Thank you for.
This has been a great honor, and I thank you for these very perceptive and stimulating questions. And I salute you and your crew and your whole audience for the existence of this vodcast. I didn't even know the word vodcast until you invited me.
There it is. So if you're listening,
I'm trying to use it 10 times. I'm trying to use it 10 times the next day, so I really do remember that wonderful word.
There you go. If you're listening to this on the podcast, you can actually watch it on the VOD. You can see what Jon D. Levenson looks like. So, and he's wearing a bow tie, which is very classy.
If you really want to do that. But I would also stress the fact that you could just watch and not listen. There's also that possibility.
You know what that is?
Yeah. That might be more profitable to some people.
Potentially.
Yeah.
Just as a reminder, guys, I would recommend, there's so much more honestly depth that is available through books than there is through conversation. So if you've enjoyed this conversation, I would encourage you to look at the show notes and explore one of these books, and the takeaways will just exponentially grow for you. So he's not paying me to say this. I'm just saying this actually out of my own experience. So Jon D. Levenson, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Be well.
Maybe we'll talk to you to come back sometime.
I'll be happy to do so.
All right. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.